in the Sonobudoyo collection. So we begin with this Ganesha. Now he sits outside, he's very unassuming, he looks pretty scraggy and messy looking, and you might pass him by and think, why would I bother with this statue? But what's interesting, that all the Ganesha in this region are wearing a type of trouser known as ngang-ngong, and it's defined by the line at the ankles. Now, I don't have a pointer, so you're going to have to use your observation when you look at the sculptures. When you study a sculpture and it's wearing a kain, it will have folds or pleats on the lotus padma in front of the legs. When you look at a Ganesha, there are no pleats or folds, so you know Ganesha is wearing trouser or ngang-ngong. What's interesting, we have this very interesting floral pattern interspersed with a geometrical motif. And this probably reflects an Indian trade cotton with a pattern of rosettes flowers. It's also a design we see in Tang, China in the 10th century, which is known as the Karahana flower. And this design is morphed into many different ideas, and we see that coming through a lot through this lecture. So if you know, the trade with China was a two-way exchange, with many goods leaving Java for China, as well as Chinese fabrics arriving in Java. However, Indian textiles had a formative effect on the design repertoire of Southeast Asian cloth, as we've seen in several studies. Therefore, it's impossible to discuss Southeast Asian textiles without an extensive reference to Indian cloth, and publications exist with a response to it from Bali, Toraja, Sulawesi, Roti, and the Flores region. So the next statue here remains outside. The Devarapala has a very nice spot here in the garden in the courtyard. So it's dated on the plaque to the 12th to the 14th centuries. But because of its relatively small size at only 2 meters, and a textile pattern you see from the drawing, which fits much more closely with those from central Java, I will propose that this statue should be given an earlier date, nearer the 11th century or even earlier than that, the beginning of the East Javanese period, and not the date that the museum may have suggested. The pattern kind represents a simple 4-petaled flower edged with a brocaded border. The sculptor knew exactly what he was doing, as the stress style, as you see, is extremely accurate and replicates the equivalent of an Indian dhoti, where the cloth is pulled up between the legs and tucked in behind, overlaid with a metal belt and a fabric sash, which is quite clear, as you notice from the drawing. The next sculpture is something that I actually got this image from a book, and I've never seen this, and I'm hoping that Karen and Fajar are going to be telling me where this is in the museum, because I'd like to see it in person. So this bronze statue has been carved with a similar type of floral pattern within horizontal bands. At 44 centimeters, that's considerably large for a bronze statue. So it was probably made for perhaps a niche in the Chandi and not as a portable item carried between India and Southeast Asia. So it would have been made here for a specific purpose. The documentary evidence for the trade with Indian textiles to Southeast Asia is sparse until the arrival of Europeans. In the earliest group of tax charters studied by Christie mentioned, quote, cloth made in India. And the date of this group is between 1840 and 1940. So we know from these examples of the new brick cottons that I show here that these type of examples, small fragments, have been found in this region from a very early period. However, in the 10th and 11th centuries saw a general Asian trade boom. Both Chinese and Indian textiles must have been available. The great scholar Ruth Barnes wrote about the Ashmolean collection that has been attempted both for earlier and later periods to identify the representation of cloth in Southeast Asia by looking at the sculptures along with specific textiles, and that's what my book is aimed to do. So I have created charts of line drawings, and at the end of each chapter in Pattern Splendor, I took the drawing of each sculpture and put it together in this form of catalogue. And as you start to look at these sculptures and the drawings, you will see how the designs evolve through the period. And I've been asked many times if I can create a clear chronology through the periods from the sculptures. You can to a point, but the 8th to 9th century, the patterns kind of moved and morphed together. We have a look at, at these ones. You see some of them become quite sophisticated to some of the earlier ones. So these are still dated in the 8th to 9th centuries. Photography, drawings and maps are hugely important to do research, and all of these drawings were made by a young Chinese student at the Royal College of Art in London, who I employed to work for me on this book. And she and I worked together for 2 years, sitting closely analysing the sculptures, and she came up with drawings as a correct, direct replica of what appears on each pattern. So this map of Central Java shows you where all the sculptures are that I've shown in my book, where they have a textile pattern. And you see that the greater amount of them actually appear in the Central Java around Borobudur and Prambanan. So they would be brought in and used to form as worship, collected at home, carried in by monks and traders. So if we begin with Central Java and the statues of the 8th to 9th century, but I want to take you to this period in China just for a moment. The early Javanese period in Javanese art styles are quite sophisticated and have all too often been described as Indian influence or in the Indian style. And in many cases this is true. However, in the next few slides, I want to highlight that the statue makers and carvers of the patrons and the textiles that were available at the time were very sophisticated. There's an article written by Yuri Kavlov in 2016, which helps us to understand what is happening in the Chinese region at this time. So I will quote just for a moment. The stylistic considerations shown in the study demonstrate that the Yuan and early Ming Sino-Tibetan art is an evolution of artistic tradition developed under the Xixiao ruler, not that of Nepal and Tibet. This conclusion corresponds well to the key role that the Xixiao Buddhist culture played in the Mongol appropriation of Buddhism and the dissemination of Tibetan teachings in Yuan China. Yuan dynasty Tibetan Buddhist imagery was instead associated with Nepalese artistic tradition, allegedly established at the imperial workshops, or never confirmed. What I'm hoping to show you that there are a lot of styles that we see in Java that we see later on in China at a similar period. These two sculptures of Vishnu, this one and the following one in gold and the one in stone, appear with stylized flower patterns. This particular Vishnu is finely cast and dressed in royal attire and is indicated by his elaborate dhoti. With this particular style, which probably originated in Java and travelled to Tibet, where it's only visible in the 12th to 13th century, as we see in the painting in the middle. There is no evidence in Indian or Tibetan art of this type of dress style any earlier than the 11th, 12th century. However, we already know about it in Java at 8th, 9th century. This confirms the idea Xixiao was receiving artistic input directly from India, not only from Tibet, but probably via Java. In fact, lavish imperial patronage attracted many foreign ministries. Masters of North India held positions in the Buddhist administration, while Tangkok translators, monks and pilgrims visited the Buddhist sites of India. Now this very small piece, none of you would have seen. It remains in the storage in Leiden, in the main museum, the Tropen Museum. And I went to see it many years ago when I was doing my early research. It's the most delightful piece, and it's so small, it's 10 feet and it just sits in your hand. But without links, it has the most extraordinary textile design. And he's actually wearing two cloths. If you look at the line across his sides at the bottom shows the lower cloth, and there is a fabric worn over the top. So he has the sashes and girdles across the body, and the wiggly lines down the front are the ties of his dress. So the facial features display some similarities to part of bronzes of northeast India. But it is possible to advocate that this may have been made somewhere else and carried into Java, or made in Java by itinerant craftsmen, perhaps as a form of portable worship. You have to remember that at this early period there was much transition through the Buddhist world of traders, travellers and craftsmen travelling backwards and forwards. Then we have this very small piece, and the exact nature of the textiles traded from the Indo-Persian sphere to Southeast Asia are unknown. However, what is known is that Indian cotton, perhaps examples such as these, were imported over a very long period. The Yuan in China also needed cloth from India, such as white cotton, for use for their soldiers who fought in the southern regions. Now, this white cotton would have traded in through Java, it would not have gone directly to China. So the white fabric came to be known in the Ming period as kalipa, In Thailand it was called bafta, and in Malaysia, in the Malay world, it was referred to just as kain. So this sculpture is dressed in an Indian dhoti in an Indian style. We don't see any evolution into the ongoing Javanese style that will be coming into later. So Indian merchants transported material by Southeast Asia on the way to China. And in Sri Vijaya, for example, Southeast Asian merchants who traded in Panpang would then re-export cloth along with other commodities. So the history of the Song dynasty mentions envoys probably arriving from Sumatra brought with them Indian textiles. And the records from the Song appear to be the first mention of Indian textiles exported to Southeast Asia. This is a really interesting small piece. This also appears in the storage in Jakarta in Leiden. Again, wouldn't have been seen by anybody. This diminutive, damaged figure of Trelok Vichai is a rare statue in Java, and this small statue remains locked away. There are no file photos, so the only photography was taken by me. This was over 12 years ago now, where I was able to capture the minute detail of this statue at only 10 centimeters. On close inspection, you see that he's actually wearing two cloths, a long plain kind that reaches to below the knees, over which is carved a shorter pattern cloth made up of horizontal bands with small alternating geometrical patterns. However, the dhoti is styled in the Tibetan style, as we see from the image on the left, which we see is an example of 100 years later. So once again, I'm highlighting that this type of dress style was known and used in Java many hundreds of years before it was actually seen in the northeast India. Now if we go to indigenous dress styles replicating Javanese statues from this period. This is one of my favourite statues. When I first saw this, it was in the National Museum in Jakarta, and it was visible in the gold room. Now it appears locked away, and you cannot see this anymore. So the images I have in my book and the drawings on pattern splendor really highlight what is now lost to many of you. So we have a male and a female. The doddot of the female on the right covers the lower part of the body to the ankles, and it's clearly worn in the Javanese style, with the fullness of the cloth depicted in each side of her body. The fabric appears ruched as if there was a substantial amount of material, which in the case of the female fans out over the top of the sash that is worn low around the hips to hold the doddot. The male figure on the left wears two cloths as seen from the rear of the body. The drawings show you the front and the back so you can see what's going on. And both consist of a horizontal band, a four-petal flower, and along the bottom we have the inverted triangle, the V shape, which perhaps represents the earliest example we have of tumpul motif, and all of you know what a tumpul is. It becomes so popular over subsequent years in Indonesian textiles. And this is probably the first time we see an example of this ubiquitous border pattern. The sash is tied in a sizable bow, represents a flower at the back of the body. In fact, the great scholar John Mixick, I'm sure many of you know about, he writes it in his gold book. He said, it is a flower. Well, I can tell you, it's not a flower. It's representation of the textile actually tied in a bow at the back of the body, so it's not meant to be a flower. It's just a stylized bow.